My Aunt Linda waited until my daughter finished serving pecan pie before telling 21 people that I was not really part of the family. I was 58, sitting at the walnut table in the farmhouse where I had spent nearly every Christmas since I was 6. Linda raised her wine glass, looked toward her son Jason, and said, "Before we discuss what belongs to whom, Carrie should remember she was adopted. Technically, she is the family's oldest Christmas present." Several people laughed because they thought it was a joke. Jason laughed because he knew it was not. Beside my chair was a red accordion folder containing a certified adoption decree, a recorded beneficiary deed, and my grandparents' final trust amendment. Linda thought it held dessert recipes. She also believed that the next morning I would sign papers allowing Jason's company to buy our family orchard for $620,000. The independent appraisal would later place the relevant property near twice that amount. I did not argue. I folded my napkin and said, "That is an interesting way to tell the story." Linda smiled as if she had one. She did not know that her own signature appeared inside the folder. Stay with me, because silence can look like surrender when it is actually the last careful step before a boundary. The role I had always played. My name is Caroline Bennett, though everyone in my family has called me Carrie since I was a child. I spent 34 years working in the Franklin County Recorder's office outside Columbus, Ohio. I was never an attorney, and I never pretended to be one. My work was less dramatic than people imagined. I checked legal descriptions, indexed deeds, rejected filings that lacked required signatures, and explained to impatient people that a document did not become valid merely because someone had printed it on expensive paper. That kind of work teaches you two things. First, most important decisions are hidden inside ordinary language. Second, people who rely on confusion become angry when someone insists on reading the final page. In my family, however, I rarely applied those lessons to myself. My biological mother, Anne, was Linda's younger sister. She died in a highway accident when I was 5. My father had already disappeared from our lives by then, and no one knew where to find him. My maternal grandparents, Henry and Ruth Mercer, brought me home from the hospital after the accident and raised me in their farmhouse near Granville, about 40 miles east of Columbus. The property was not a grand estate. It was a white 2-story house with a deep porch, a red equipment barn, 46 acres of apple trees, and a narrow creek that flooded every third spring. My grandfather repaired agricultural pumps and tractors. My grandmother sold preserves at weekend markets and kept an accounting ledger so precise that she could tell you the price of canning lids in 1987 without looking it up. Linda was already 21 when my mother died. She had married Dale Whitaker the year before and lived 10 minutes away. For the first few months, she came often. She brought casseroles, folded my clothes, and told people she was helping her parents through an impossible time. Then grief became routine, and routine was not something Linda enjoyed unless she could direct it. My grandparents enrolled me in school, took me to counseling, sat through my nightmares, and learned how to braid hair from a library book. 2 years later, after efforts to locate my father failed, they petitioned to adopt me. The process took months. There were interviews, notices, background checks, and a hearing at the county courthouse. I remember only pieces of that day: my grandmother's blue coat, the polished wood around the judge's bench, and my grandfather squeezing my hand when the judge asked whether I understood what adoption meant. I said, "It means I get to stay." For most of my childhood, that was enough. Linda never openly opposed the adoption. In fact, she signed an affidavit supporting it. She wrote that her parents had been my primary caregivers since my mother's death and that adoption would provide the permanency and security Caroline deserves. Those exact words mattered later. At the time, they were simply part of a file my grandparents kept in a red accordion folder in the bottom drawer of their desk. But Linda's behavior changed after the adoption became final. She began using small phrases that separated me from everyone else. At birthdays, she would say I was lucky to have landed with such generous people. When my grandfather taught me to drive the tractor, she joked that I was receiving the deluxe rescue package. If my grandmother bought me a winter coat, Linda commented that I had expensive taste for someone who had arrived with nothing. None of those remarks sounded serious enough to challenge. That was their purpose. My grandparents corrected her when they heard. My grandfather would say, "Carrie is our daughter. That is the end of it." My grandmother was quieter but sharper. Once, after Linda called me a charity case at Thanksgiving, Ruth placed the serving spoon down and said, "Charity is something you give from a distance. We are raising our child." Linda did not repeat the phrase in front of them. She saved it for car rides, side conversations, and family gatherings when the room was noisy enough to give her cover. I learned early that confronting Linda created a second problem. The first problem was what she said. The second was her performance afterward. "You are so sensitive, Carrie. I was trying to make you feel included. Everyone knows I love you. Do not punish the whole family because you misunderstood one sentence." My weakness was not that I believed her. It was that I feared losing the only family I had left. My mother was gone. I had no relationship with my father. My grandparents were my parents in every meaningful and legal sense, but I still carried the childhood knowledge that families could disappear without warning. So I became useful. Useful people are difficult to exile. I helped my grandparents with the orchard bookkeeping through high school. I drove my grandmother to appointments when her eyesight began failing. I filed insurance forms, handled vendor contracts, repaired the old point-of-sale system at the farm stand, and eventually arranged seasonal workers after my grandfather's knees made climbing ladders dangerous. When I married my husband, Michael Bennett, we bought a modest house in Westerville. Michael was a high school science teacher with a calm way of asking one question at a time. He recognized Linda's pattern before I did. "She makes you audition for a place you already have," he told me after one Christmas dinner. I defended her out of habit. "She lost in 2. "So did you," he said. "You were 5. Michael never pushed me to cut anyone off. He simply refused to pretend that cruelty became harmless when delivered with a smile. We had one daughter, Megan, who inherited his patience and my habit of noticing details. Megan became a school counselor. By the time she was 32, she could identify emotional manipulation faster than I could, although she was careful not to use professional language as a weapon. "Aunt Linda does not joke with you," Megan once said. "She tests what everyone will let her say." I knew she was right. Still, I continued smoothing things over. When Linda's husband Dale lost his job at a printing company, Michael and I covered 3 months of their mortgage. When Jason needed tuition money after changing colleges, my grandparents and I contributed $12,000. When Linda organized my grandmother's 80th birthday, I paid the caterer because Linda had temporarily reached her card limit. She never reimbursed me. Jason grew up watching his mother treat my reliability as a family resource. He was charming, ambitious, and permanently on the edge of a larger plan. He sold medical equipment, tried residential flipping, started a landscaping company, and eventually formed Whitaker Development Group with 2 investors from Cincinnati. His projects were always described as almost successful. The next contract would stabilize everything. The next property would erase the last loss. The next loan would be safe because the market was about to turn. I liked Jason when we were younger. He could be funny without being cruel, and he was kind to Megan when they were children. But adulthood rewarded his confidence more than his judgment. He learned that if he spoke quickly and treated questions as personal insults, people often agreed before they understood what they had accepted. My grandfather died when I was 49. Michael died of pancreatic cancer 4 years later. Losing them within such a short span changed the balance of the family. The 2 people most willing to say enough were gone. I spent the next several years caring for my grandmother. Linda visited on Sundays, brought flowers, and posted photographs online. I handled medications, tax bills, home repairs, orchard leases, and the difficult nightly calls when Ruth woke frightened and forgot that Henry was dead. I do not mention that to claim moral superiority. Linda had a husband, a son, and her own obligations. What hurt was not that she did less. What hurt was that she described what I did as evidence that I owed the family more. "You live closer to the office," she would say when paperwork needed filing. "You understand accounts. Mom trusts you with those boring things." The red accordion folder moved from my grandparents' desk to my house during those years. Ruth gave it to me one afternoon after we met with her estate attorney, Samuel Ortiz. The folder was faded at the corners and had Henry and Ruth important written across the front in my grandfather's block printing. "Keep this where Linda cannot tidy it away," Ruth said. I thought she was making a dry joke. My grandmother rarely accused anyone directly. Inside were my adoption records, the deed history, trust documents, a letter from my mother, and several handwritten notes. I read the adoption decree, but I did not study the property papers. Samuel had explained the plan in plain language. The orchard acreage would remain in a family trust, Linda and I would be beneficiaries, and the house with the 12 acres around it would pass to me because I had cared for Ruth and because my grandparents wanted me to have a secure home if I ever chose to return. I told Ruth it was too much. She said, "A home is not a prize for winning the suffering contest." Your father and I made a decision. She called Henry my father without hesitation. She always had. The beneficiary deed for the farmhouse parcel was recorded while Ruth was alive. I knew that. Linda knew it too because Samuel sent both of us a summary after the estate meeting. But families are capable of behaving as though a fact has vanished if no one says it aloud for long enough. After Ruth died at 91, I could not bear to move into the farmhouse. I rented it to a retired couple, Nora and Pete Lang, at a below-market rate in exchange for their watching the property and maintaining the garden. The orchard itself was leased to a local grower, and the income went into the trust for taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Linda became the initial trustee. I agreed because I was exhausted and because she wanted the role. Samuel warned us that a trustee had strict duties and that any sale involving a family member would require careful documentation, independent valuation, and full disclosure. Linda nodded through the meeting. For 2 years, the arrangement seemed manageable. Then Jason decided the orchard should become a residential development. He called it Mercer Grove. The name appeared first on a glossy presentation Linda brought to Easter dinner. It showed curved streets, 34 houses, decorative ponds, and a restored farmhouse serving as a community heritage center. The farmhouse was mine, but the presentation did not mention that. Jason said his company could buy the full 46 acres for $620,000. He called it a family price that would avoid commissions, delays, and outside interference. I asked whether he had an appraisal. Linda sighed. "Carrie, must every family conversation become a records office seminar?" Jason leaned forward. "The land needs infrastructure. People see acreage and imagine cash. They do not see roads, sewer, drainage, and approvals." I said I understood development costs. I also understood that a broker had estimated the combined property at more than $1 million the year before. "That was not an appraisal," Jason said. "Then order one." He smiled, but his eyes changed. "We will." They did not. Instead, the subject returned at every gathering. Linda spoke about the burden of being trustee. Jason described urgent market conditions. Dale said very little, which was his usual response when silence protected him from choosing between comfort and truth. I kept asking for documents. They kept telling me not to make family difficult. By the December when Linda held up her wine glass and announced that I was adopted, the purchase agreement had already been drafted. They needed my signature for reasons they had not fully explained. And Linda had decided the easiest way to obtain it was to make me feel grateful that I had ever been allowed at the table. The betrayal they thought I would accept. Christmas at the farmhouse had been Linda's idea. Nora and Pete were visiting their children in Arizona, and the house was empty for 3 weeks. Linda said it would be meaningful to gather there one more time before the property moved into its next chapter. That phrase bothered me. Nothing had been approved. No appraisal had been completed. Yet Linda spoke as though the sale were a matter of scheduling. I almost refused to host. Then Megan reminded me that the house was legally mine and that allowing a holiday dinner did not surrender anything. You can leave whenever you want, she said. You do not have to earn your seat. I arrived at noon with pies, linens, and the red accordion folder. I had brought the folder because Samuel had emailed me 2 days earlier asking whether I possessed the original trust amendment and adoption affidavit. Linda's attorney had requested confirmation of beneficiary status before the proposed transaction. That wording was unusual. My status had never been uncertain. Samuel advised me not to sign anything until he reviewed the complete purchase agreement and title materials. He also told me to bring the original records home after Christmas rather than leave them at the farmhouse. Linda arrived an hour later wearing a cream cashmere sweater and carrying 3 poinsettias. She walked through the rooms as though inspecting a hotel before an event. You left grandmother's desk in here, she said when she entered the small front office. It belongs with the house. It is very dated. So is the house. She gave me a thin smile. Jason's designer can make it useful. There it was again. Not if. When. Jason arrived with his wife, Beth, and 2 children. He brought a bottle of bourbon and a leather portfolio. The portfolio remained beside his chair during dinner, just as my red folder remained beside mine. For the first hour, the gathering felt almost normal. Children ran between rooms. Dale carved the turkey. Megan helped my great-niece fix a broken bracelet. Linda told a long story about a neighbor's kitchen renovation. No one mentioned the orchard. Then Jason began discussing construction prices with one of Dale's brothers. He said his company was closing a legacy parcel before the end of the year. I looked at him. Which parcel? He lifted his glass. This one, assuming everyone keeps their word. I have not given you my word. Linda interrupted. You said you wanted the land kept in the family. I said I would consider a fair proposal. It is a fair proposal. Then an independent appraisal should support it. The conversation paused. Not dramatically. Forks continued moving. A child asked for more potatoes. But several adults began listening without appearing to listen. Jason opened his leather portfolio and removed a document clipped with a silver binder. We can settle this tomorrow morning. The title company has a mobile notary available at 10. I did not touch the document. Why would a title company schedule a notary before I received the final agreement? You received the term sheet. A 2-page term sheet is not a purchase agreement. Linda leaned back. This is exactly why your grandfather never wanted lawyers involved in family matters. My grandfather had used lawyers for every property transfer he made. Megan looked at me, but I shook my head slightly. I still believed I could get through dinner without a confrontation. That was when Linda stood to propose a toast. She thanked everyone for honoring Henry and Ruth's memory. She praised Jason for wanting to preserve the Mercer name. Then she looked directly at me. And since we are being technical tonight, she said, we should probably remind Carrie that she was adopted. Technically, she is the family's oldest Christmas present. The laughter came in fragments. Dale gave one uncomfortable breath through his nose. Beth looked down. One of Linda's cousins said, "Oh, Linda," but smiled as though the remark were merely mischievous. Jason laughed openly. I felt the old childhood sensation return before I could reason with it, the sense that the room belonged to everyone else and my place in it depended on responding correctly. If I became angry, I would prove I was unstable. If I cried, I would spoil Christmas. If I left, I would be accused of punishing the children. If I laughed, the insult would become harmless history. Linda had used that trap for decades. I placed my napkin beside my plate. That is an interesting way to tell the story, I said. Her smile widened. It is not a story, sweetheart. It is just a fact. We all love you, obviously. Obviously, Megan said, so quietly only the people nearest us heard. Jason pushed the clipped agreement toward me. Nobody is questioning your feelings, Carrie. But we do need to separate emotion from business. The sentence was almost impressive in its arrangement. His mother had just used my adoption to reduce my standing at a Christmas table, and now he was warning me not to become emotional. I asked, what exactly do you need me to sign? A consent to the sale, an acknowledgement of the trust distribution, and a limited easement agreement. What easement? Foresight access. Across the farmhouse parcel? He hesitated half a second. Temporarily. That half-second mattered. The orchard's public road frontage was narrow and crossed a low wet area. The practical entrance used by farm trucks ran along the western side of the farmhouse parcel. Without permanent access across my 12 acres, Jason's proposed development would require a costly bridge, drainage work, and additional approval. He was not merely asking me to approve the trust sale of orchard land. He needed an easement across property I owned outright. How much are you offering for the easement? I asked. Linda's expression changed. Offering? Yes. It is part of the family agreement, Jason said. There is no family agreement. He tapped the document. There will be when you sign. I reached for the pages, not to sign but to read. The purchase price was $620,000 for the trust acreage. The easement across my parcel was described as non-exclusive access ancillary to the transaction, with no separate payment. Another clause required me to waive any claim arising from prior trustee decisions. A third stated that I acknowledged having no ownership interest in the farmhouse beyond a revocable family occupancy arrangement. I read that clause twice. The farmhouse was not a revocable arrangement. The beneficiary deed had transferred title to me upon Ruth's death. It had been recorded. Taxes were in my name. Insurance was in my name. The tenant's lease was with me. I asked Linda, who wrote this? Our attorney reviewed it, she said. That is not what I asked. Jason answered. The title company needed clean language. Clean for whom? His voice hardened. For everyone. I turned to the signature page. The line beneath my name identified me as Caroline Bennett, adopted descendant and contingent trust beneficiary. Contingent. The final trust amendment named me as an equal remainder beneficiary. My adoption decree made me my grandparents' legal child. Neither status was contingent. I closed the agreement. Linda said, do not create a scene. I looked around the dining room. She had announced my adoption to 21 people, and I was the one being warned against creating a scene. I am not signing this, I said. Jason's face flushed. You have not read the full package. I have read enough to know it contains false statements. That is your interpretation. Recorded ownership is not an interpretation. Linda set down her wine glass. Your grandparents took you in when they did not have to. They gave you a childhood, paid for college, and left you a place to live. Now Jason is trying to protect what generations built, and you are counting every inch as though you bought it yourself. The room became quieter then. Her meaning was no longer disguised as humor. I heard my grandmother's voice from years earlier, we are raising our child. But I also heard my own old fear. Do not lose the family. Do not make them choose. Do not become difficult to keep. I stood and lifted the red folder from beside my chair. Linda glanced at it. Are those the dessert recipes? No. I could have opened it then. I could have placed the adoption decree beside her plate and read her own affidavit aloud. I could have shown everyone the recorded deed and asked why the agreement described my house as a temporary favor. But Samuel's warning returned to me. Do not argue from memory. Do not surrender originals. Do not sign. Bring the records home. So I slid the purchase agreement into the outer pocket of my folder. I will have this reviewed, I said. Jason stood. The offer expires December 28th. It was December 25th. You gave me a 3-day deadline over Christmas? We have investors waiting. That is not my emergency. Linda said, if you walk out now, do not pretend this is about paperwork. This is about you resenting the fact that you were never really a Mercer. Megan rose beside me. Mom is a Mercer because Grandma and Grandpa made her one. The law did not ask for your permission. Linda looked at her as though a child had interrupted adults. Megan, you do not understand the history. I understand enough. Dale finally spoke. Maybe everyone should cool down. Linda turned on him. Not now, Dale. That was all it took for him to become silent again. I put on my coat. I thanked Beth for bringing the salad. I hugged the children because none of this belonged to them. Then I walked out of the farmhouse carrying the red folder against my chest. Megan followed me to the porch. Snow had begun falling lightly, collecting on the rail my grandfather had repaired 3 times rather than replace. Open the folder, Megan said. I know what is in it. No, she said. You know what Grandma told you. Tonight, they showed you what they are willing to claim. Read everything. She was right. At home, after midnight, I spread the papers across my dining table. The adoption decree was first. The recorded deed was second. The trust amendment was third. Then I found an envelope I had never opened, sealed with my grandmother's handwriting across the front. For Carrie, if Linda ever says you do not belong. I sat alone in my quiet house with Christmas lights still glowing in the front window. For the first time, I understood that my grandmother had not been guessing about the future. She had been preparing me for it. The details that didn't make sense. I did not open the envelope immediately. That may sound strange. After Linda's public insult and the false statements in the purchase agreement, any sensible person might have torn it open at once. But my grandmother's handwriting made the moment feel final. As long as the envelope remained sealed, Ruth was still the person who had anticipated a problem. Once I opened it, she would become the person explaining something she had not trusted herself to say while alive. Instead, I began with the documents I understood. My adoption decree was dated April 18, 1975. It named Henry and Ruth Mercer as my legal parents and changed my surname from Hale to Mercer. The order stated that I would possess the same legal rights as a child born to them, including inheritance rights under state law. Attached was Linda's affidavit. I had seen it years before, but I had never absorbed the contradiction between her words then and her behavior later. She had signed under oath that adoption would formalize the parent-child relationship that already exists. She also stated that she supported my becoming a permanent and equal member of the Mercer family. Permanent. Equal. Not a guest. Not a charity case. Not an old Christmas present. The signature was unmistakable. Linda Whitaker, then Linda Mercer Whitaker, written in the same slanted hand she still used on birthday cards. The second document was the beneficiary deed. Ruth had signed it 6 years before her death. It transferred the farmhouse and a surveyed 12-acre parcel to me upon her death, outside the trust. The recorder's stamp showed it had been filed the following morning. A legal description identified the Western Access Drive as part of my parcel. The third document was the final trust amendment. It divided the remaining trust assets equally between Linda and me after expenses. More importantly, it limited Linda's authority to sell real estate to a related party. Any such sale required an independent appraisal, written disclosure to all beneficiaries, and approval by Samuel Ortiz as trust protector. Jason's proposed transaction had none of those things. No appraisal. No complete disclosure. No approval from Samuel. The purchase agreement's waiver clause suddenly made sense. If I signed, I would not only consent to a below-market sale. I would waive objections to the process that made it possible. I called Samuel at 8:30 the next morning. He answered from his kitchen, apologizing for the noise of grandchildren in the background. "I expected your call," he said. "Did you know they scheduled a notary for today?" "No." "Did you approve a related party sale?" "No." "Did Linda's attorney tell you I was a contingent beneficiary?" There was a pause. He asked whether your adoption records established legal descendant status. I assumed he was conducting title review. He drafted a document saying I have no ownership interest in the farmhouse. "Send it to me now." I scanned the agreement and emailed it. Samuel called back 20 minutes later. "Do not communicate by telephone with Jason about this," he said. "Email only. Preserve every version of every document." Is the agreement fraudulent? I am not going to use that word before I know who prepared which clause and what representations were made. It is inaccurate. It is also materially favorable to Jason. Can Linda sell the orchard without me? Not to Jason under the current trust terms. A sale to an unrelated buyer could potentially proceed under the trustee's authority if properly conducted, but you would still be entitled to notice and accounting. This transaction requires safeguards she has not followed. What about the easement? That is your property. No one can grant it except you. I asked the question that had kept me awake. Why would they describe my ownership as temporary when the deed is recorded? Samuel exhaled. Because the development is far less valuable without that access. I suspect they hoped you would sign before conducting an independent review. Suspect was not proof. I reminded myself of that. Years in the recorder's office had taught me not to confuse a troubling pattern with a completed conclusion. So I began assembling facts. The first fact came from the county auditor's website. The farmhouse parcel was assessed separately in my name, exactly as I expected. The orchard acreage remained titled to the Mercer Family Trust. The second fact came from an email Linda had sent 6 months earlier. She had asked me to confirm that Nora and Pete's lease would end if the family decides to redevelop. I had replied that any decision affecting my parcel would require my approval. She answered with a thumbs-up symbol. That made it difficult for her to claim she did not know I owned the house. The third fact came from the survey attached to Jason's presentation. A dashed line marked Primary Community Access followed the western drive across my parcel. The legend listed the route as existing private access to be dedicated. Dedicated by whom was not stated. The fourth fact came from a title commitment Samuel obtained with my permission. Jason's company had opened the title file in October, 2 months before Christmas. The commitment listed my recorded deed as an exception. It specifically stated that an easement or conveyance from Caroline Bennett would be required for proposed access. Jason knew. The fifth fact was more personal. Megan remembered overhearing Linda and Jason during Thanksgiving cleanup. Linda had said, once Carrie signs the beneficiary acknowledgement, the rest is administrative. At the time, Megan assumed they were discussing trust distributions. Now the phrase sounded different. Still, memory was not a recording. It was context, not proof. I emailed Linda and Jason together that afternoon. I wrote that I would not sign the purchase agreement because it misstated my beneficiary status and ownership. I requested the independent appraisal required by the trust, all offers or valuations received, the complete title commitment, communications with the title company concerning my parcel, and a full trust accounting for the previous 24 months. I also offered a reasonable path forward. If Jason wanted to purchase the orchard, I would consider the proposal after an independent appraisal and competitive review. If access across my parcel was essential, I was willing to discuss a separately valued easement with limits protecting the farmhouse, tenants, creek, and existing trees. I proposed that we use a neutral mediator experienced in family property disputes. I expected anger. I did not expect how quickly it arrived. Linda replied within 14 minutes. This demand is insulting. As trustee, I have kept the property operating while you collected rent and contributed nothing. Jason's proposal preserves the family legacy. Your sudden obsession with technicalities confirms exactly what I said last night. You do not understand what this land means to those of us born into it. I read the message twice. Then I opened the trust bank statements I already possessed. I had contributed more than $18,000 over 3 years for roof repairs, septic work, and orchard insurance when trust income was short. The rent from Nora and Pete went toward property taxes and maintenance on my parcel. Linda knew that because I sent her annual summaries. Jason's reply came an hour later. Your attorney is creating unnecessary conflict. The price reflects development risk. If we miss the December deadline, investors may withdraw and the family could lose a rare opportunity. I need your signed consent by noon tomorrow. I wrote back, the deadline was created before I received the agreement. I will not sign inaccurate documents under pressure. He responded, then any loss is on you. That sentence clarified something for me. Their plan required me to carry responsibility for consequences created by their timetable, their pricing, and their omissions. The next morning, Linda called despite my request for email communication. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was calm. Carrie, I am trying to prevent this from becoming ugly. Jason has people relying on him. Dale and I have spent years managing family expectations. You have already received more than anyone could reasonably expect. Please stop hiding behind paperwork and call me before you embarrass yourself. I saved the voicemail. Then I finally opened my grandmother's envelope. Inside were 3 pages written in Ruth's small, steady handwriting and 1 photocopy of a check. The letter began. My dear Carrie, if you are reading this, Linda has probably made belonging sound like a debt you have failed to repay. I had to stop after that sentence. Ruth wrote that she and Henry adopted me because they loved me and because I was their daughter in every way that mattered. She said Linda had supported the adoption publicly but struggled privately with what she believed it might mean for inheritance. Over the years, Linda had repeatedly asked whether bloodline property should pass to Jason rather than to me. My grandparents had refused. Ruth explained that the farmhouse transfer was not charity. It recognized years of care, money I had invested, and a promise Henry made when I was 7, that I would always have a place where no one could tell me I did not belong. Then the letter turned practical. Ruth said she had discovered a check drawn from her account 3 years earlier, payable to Whitaker Development Group for $25,000. Linda had described it as reimbursement for orchard planning. Ruth had not authorized the payment. Jason returned the money after Samuel confronted him, calling it a bookkeeping misunderstanding. The photocopy was attached. That incident was why Ruth amended the trust to require Samuel's approval for related party transactions. I had not known. The final paragraph was the part that changed the red folder from a container of legal papers into something else. Do not use these documents to humiliate Linda, Ruth wrote. Use them to keep anyone from rewriting your life. Papers cannot make a family love correctly. They can, however, prevent a lie from becoming an ownership record. I sat at my dining table until the winter light shifted across the floor. Then Samuel called with another development. The title company had emailed him a copy of a beneficiary family history statement submitted by Linda as trustee. It described me as a niece raised by Henry and Ruth, but said the adoption file was believed incomplete and that the farmhouse transfer had been intended only as a lifetime occupancy arrangement. Linda had signed the statement in November. She had signed it despite possessing the estate summary, despite her own adoption affidavit, and despite the recorded deed. Samuel was careful. This does not by itself establish criminal intent, he said. People can claim misunderstanding. But the title company needs corrected information immediately. I looked at Linda's old affidavit on my table. Permanent and equal member of the Mercer family. Her signature had once helped make my place secure. Now another signature was being used to make that same place uncertain. The details no longer looked like careless family communication. They looked like a strategy. The truth I could no longer ignore. Samuel sent the corrected documents to the title company that afternoon. He included the certified adoption decree, the recorded deed, and the trust amendment. He did not accuse Linda of fraud. He stated only that her family history statement contained material inaccuracies and that no transaction involving Jason could proceed without the required appraisal, disclosure, and approval. The title company suspended the file. Jason called me 6 times in 40 minutes. I did not answer. His final voicemail said, "You have no idea what you have done." For once, I did. I had prevented an inaccurate document from moving one step closer to becoming an accepted fact. Linda responded by calling relatives. By evening, 3 people had contacted me to say I was destroying a family opportunity over an old joke. One cousin said Linda had explained that I was confused about the legal meaning of adoption. Another said Jason had already invested nearly $48,000 in engineering and option fees. That amount was not in any disclosure I had received. Samuel requested the invoices. Jason refused, saying his company records were confidential. He also claimed that the trust owed his company reimbursement if the sale failed. There was no signed agreement supporting that claim. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I asked for proof, they answered with urgency. Every time I identified an inaccuracy, they answered with emotion. Every time their own decision created risk, they assigned that risk to me. 2 days after Christmas, Dale came to my house alone. He stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and looked older than he had at dinner. "I should have said something," he told me. "Yes." He nodded, accepting the answer without defense. Dale said Linda had known about my deed from the beginning. He had been present when Samuel delivered the estate summary after Ruth's death. Linda had complained in the car that the farmhouse should have gone to Jason because I already owned a home. Did she say the adoption was incomplete? I asked. No. She said your grandmother had made sure the adoption could never be questioned. Dale also told me that Jason's investors expected control of the access road. Without it, their projected lot count dropped and the drainage costs increased sharply. Jason had assured them the easement was a family formality. Why are you telling me now? Because Linda keeps saying she made one mistake in wording. This was not one mistake. He handed me a printed email. Linda had sent it to him and Jason in October. One sentence was highlighted, "Carrie will sign if we keep this about gratitude rather than price." Dale said, "I did not understand what she meant until Christmas." I believed he had understood enough to remain quiet. Still, the email mattered. I sent a copy to Samuel and preserved the original. Then I called Linda for the first time since Christmas. I told her I knew about the title statement, the email, and the requirement for my easement. I told her I had her 1975 affidavit supporting my adoption. She was silent for several seconds. Then she said, "You went through private messages with my husband?" "No. Dale brought me an email you sent him. He had no right." "Did you have the right to describe my recorded deed as a temporary arrangement? You know what Mother intended." "Yes. I have her letter." That unsettled her more than the legal documents. "What letter?" "A letter she left in the adoption folder." Linda's voice became smaller. Mother was confused near the end. The trust amendment was signed 4 years before she died, with medical capacity documentation in the attorney's file. "You sound like a clerk." "I was a clerk. It is one of the reasons you expected me to read what you wanted me to sign." She began crying then, but even her grief came with an accusation. She said Ruth had always favored me because of guilt over Anne's death. She said every family decision had revolved around protecting me. She said Jason had spent his life watching property that should have been his divided with someone who had entered the family through tragedy. I listened without interrupting. For the first time, I understood that Linda's cruelty was not based on uncertainty about whether I belonged. She knew I belonged. She resented it. That truth was harder than the Christmas joke because it removed the excuse of ignorance. I said, "You were allowed to feel disappointed. You were not allowed to falsify my status to get my property." She replied, "I did what I thought was necessary for my son." There it was, her justification, clean and complete. I ended the call knowing that no document could repair what she had just admitted. The line I finally drew. Samuel recommended a formal beneficiary meeting with a neutral mediator. I agreed on one condition: no transaction would be discussed until Linda produced a complete accounting and corrected her statement to the title company in writing. Linda refused the correction. She said Samuel's submission had already created enough confusion. So Samuel exercised the authority Ruth had given him as trust protector. He froze any related party sale pending review and required an independent appraisal paid by the trust. He also requested bank records, contracts, invoices, and communications concerning Mercer Grove. This was not a court judgment. No one was arrested. No sheriff arrived at the farmhouse. It was simply the trust operating according to the rules my grandparents had written after the unexplained $25,000 payment. Jason called the freeze an abuse of power. Linda called it betrayal. I called it reading the final page. I sent one last settlement proposal. Jason could submit a new offer after the appraisal. Any purchase would be reviewed against the open market. The easement would be separately valued and limited by engineering protections. Linda could remain trustee if she corrected the title statement, disclosed all expenses, and agreed that a professional co-trustee would supervise any family transaction. I did not ask for an apology. I did not ask anyone to admit motive. I gave them a path that protected the property without publicly shaming them. They rejected it the same day. Jason wrote that outside oversight would make the project impossible. Linda wrote that she would never accept supervision from strangers in a family matter. That answer clarified the choice. They did not merely want the orchard. They wanted the orchard without independent scrutiny. I instructed Samuel to pursue Linda's removal as trustee if she failed to provide the accounting by January 15th. I also notified Nora and Pete in writing that their lease remained valid and that no one had authority to enter, survey, or advertise my parcel without permission. Then I changed the locks on the farmhouse office. That small act affected me more than the legal notices. The old brass key had hung for years on a hook inside my kitchen. Linda had a copy because family members always had copies. I had treated access as proof of trust even after trust disappeared. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I placed one inside the red folder. The folder had once meant evidence that I was allowed to stay. Now it meant authority to decide who entered. Megan asked whether I felt relieved. Not yet, I said. I felt grief. I felt guilt. I imagined every future holiday divided into separate rooms. I worried about Dale. I worried about Linda's grandchildren, who had done nothing wrong. I even worried about Jason's investors, though they had chosen to rely on promises they should have verified. A boundary does not erase love. It forces love to live without access to whatever it has been exploiting. On January 15, Linda produced only partial records. The statements showed that the trust had paid $14,600 to Whitaker Development Group for planning consultation. There was no written engagement agreement and no approval from Samuel. Jason claimed the payments reimbursed legitimate survey work, but several invoices were addressed to his company rather than the trust. Samuel gave Linda 10 days to restore the disputed amount or document the trust's obligation. She did neither. He filed a petition in probate court seeking an accounting and temporary replacement trustee. The court scheduled a hearing 6 weeks later. That was realistic law. Notices, deadlines, responses, and waiting. Linda told relatives I had sued her over being called adopted. I stopped correcting every version of the story. People willing to believe that explanation were not asking for facts. They were asking for permission to remain comfortable. The day everything changed. The independent appraisal arrived in early February. The orchard acreage alone was valued at $940,000. My farmhouse parcel, including the access route, was valued at $360,000. Together, the property was worth approximately $1,300,000 before development approvals. Jason's offer had been $620,000 for the trust land, plus a free easement across my property and a waiver of prior trustee decisions. At the probate hearing, the judge did not decide the entire dispute. She reviewed the trust language, the incomplete accounting, the related party payments, and the title statement. She appointed a temporary professional fiduciary to manage the trust while the accounting continued. Linda's attorney agreed that no sale to Jason would proceed during the review. The change was procedural, not theatrical. Yet it ended the assumption that Linda could define family history and property rights by speaking first. After the hearing, Samuel arranged one final conference in a courthouse meeting room. Linda, Dale, Jason, Megan, Samuel, the temporary fiduciary, and I sat around a rectangular table under fluorescent lights. Jason argued that the appraisal ignored development costs. The fiduciary said he was free to submit a supported offer like any other buyer. Linda said the trust had become impossible because I refused to honor Henry and Ruth's wishes. That was when I opened the red accordion folder. I placed the adoption decree on the table first. Then Linda's affidavit. Then the beneficiary deed, trust amendment, her October email, and the family history statement she had given the title company. I did not read Ruth's private letter aloud. Some truths do not need an audience to become real. I pointed to Linda's 1975 signature. "You told the court I was a permanent and equal member of this family," I said. "At Christmas, you used my adoption to suggest I had less standing. In November, you told a title company the adoption might be incomplete. All three versions cannot be true." Linda stared at the affidavit for a long time. Jason said, "This is ancient history." "No," the fiduciary replied. "It is relevant to the accuracy of the trustee's representations." Dale spoke before Linda could stop him. "She knew the adoption was final," he said. "She knew about the deed. I was there." Linda looked at him with a kind of disbelief I recognized. It was the expression of someone discovering that silence was no longer available on demand. No one applauded. Linda did not confess. Jason did not apologize. But the story they had relied on could no longer survive contact with the documents. Within a month, Linda resigned as trustee through a negotiated agreement. She and Jason repaid the $14,600 without admitting wrongdoing. The professional fiduciary listed the orchard with a land broker after obtaining updated environmental and access studies. Jason's investors withdrew. His company did not collapse, but Mercer Grove ended. He had spent money pursuing a project before securing the rights it required. That consequence belonged to his decision, not to my refusal. 6 months later, the trust sold the orchard to a regional grower for $975,000. The buyer wanted to preserve agricultural use and did not require residential access across my parcel. After expenses, Linda and I received equal distributions under the trust. I did not receive more because I had been hurt. Linda did not receive less because she had hurt me. The documents were followed as written. That fairness mattered more than revenge. What remained afterward? The first Christmas after the sale, Megan and I ate dinner at the farmhouse with Nora, Pete, Dale, and a few friends. Linda was not there. Jason was not there. Dale and Linda had separated for several months after the trust dispute. They later began counseling and stayed married, but he stopped asking me to pretend nothing had happened. He visited occasionally and spoke carefully, as though learning that peace built on silence was only delay. My relationship with Linda remained damaged. She sent one letter saying she regretted that the property disagreement became personal. She did not mention Christmas, the title statement, or the email about gratitude. I replied that I was open to a conversation when she could name what she had done without turning it into something that happened by itself. She never answered. Jason contacted me once to ask whether I would sell the farmhouse parcel. I said no. He replied with a single word, understood. I kept the property, but I did not move back permanently. Nora and Pete remained tenants, and I spent weekends repairing the porch, sorting Ruth's kitchen, and restoring the small office where the red folder had once lived. On the wall above the desk, I framed a copy of the adoption decree. Not because I needed daily proof that Henry and Ruth were my parents. I framed it because the order contained the sentence I had answered as a 7-year-old. The adoption was in my best interest and would provide a permanent home. For most of my life, I thought permanence meant no one could leave me. I understand it differently now. Permanence means another person's resentment cannot erase what was lawfully and lovingly given. It means gratitude does not require surrender. It means being adopted did not make me less real, less loved, or less entitled to ask what I was signing. The original papers remain in the red accordion folder. The new farmhouse key rests in the front pocket. Ruth's letter is sealed inside an archival sleeve, private but no longer hidden. Sometimes I think about Linda's Christmas joke and the laughter that followed. I used to wonder which relatives believed her. Now I wonder why I spent so many years treating every laugh as a verdict. A family can give someone a name, a home, and a place at the table. It can also spend years making that person fear those gifts are conditional. The hardest lesson was realizing that protecting my place did not destroy the family. The family had already been damaged by the demand that I remain grateful enough to accept dishonesty. The papers did not make Linda love me correctly. My grandmother had warned me they could not. They did something quieter and more important. They kept a lie from becoming the official record of my life. When someone uses family history to pressure you into surrendering something that is legally and morally yours, do you preserve the relationship by staying silent, or preserve yourself by finally placing the truth on the table?